Concerns are growing over ASEAN unity as it marks its 50th anniversary, as ASEAN's ambition to move beyond an initial mandate of confidence building towards preventative diplomacy and conflict resolution gained any momentum. China's low-profile diplomacy has been replaced by a more visible role on the world stage, as the Belt and Road Initiative recognizes Asia's economic geography. Will China stand as guardian of globalization in the region? While the Trump administration does not yet have clear policy lines on Asia, will the Shangri-La Dialogue provide a platform for Washington to reaffirm America's strategic commitment to its Asian allies?
Our various trade representatives and negotiators did their best to make sure that they could bring back something which the political leaderships could stand by and support.
As the security structure evolves, geographical tensions, including the South China Sea, will remain major tests for the future. What are the solutions for the security challenges of a multipolar Asia-Pacific? CGTN anchor Yang Rui is joined by 5 distinguished panelists in today's discussion. They are Lin Tai-wei from the East Asian Institute, National University of Singapore, and co-author of The Rise of China in India, a New Asian Drama. Andrew Staples, Director of the Economist Corporate Network in Southeast Asia. Rohan Mukherjee, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Yale and US College, with a joint appointment by courtesy of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Brendan Taylor, Director of the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs at the College of Asia and the Pacific, Australian National University. And Benjamin A. Schuchman from the Division of Social Sciences at Yale and US.
In the wake of a more isolationist political thinking in the West, with many developed economies turning inward, China is reaching out, seeking more inclusive global trade and investment links. ASEAN is one of China's major partners. Economic relations between the two sides have been growing strongly. But does this mean China will replace the US and assume the regional leadership? Welcome to the special edition of Dialogue in Singapore. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our special program, gentlemen. Now, Vice President Mike Pence said recently that his President Donald Trump will attend the 5th US-ASEAN Summit. Now, at the same time, the latest news is that the US government has decided to reject the climate pact. But what do you think of the US leadership in this region, which is full of uncertainties?
Drawing from the Paris Agreement, that's certainly evidence that the States is stepping back from its leadership role that it's been playing, particularly in the post-war period. Donald Trump taking the States out of the TPP the 3rd day in office, I think it was, is further evidence of that. At the same time, we've seen a ramp up of military operations within this region as well. So it's very difficult to see, very difficult to conclude that the States is stepping back from its leadership role, but it seems to be evolving and changing.
Rohan, do you think Donald Trump is so bad to damage American reputation and credibility?
Well, I do think that there's a withdrawal or a retreat that's taking place alongside other things. He has seemed to sort of flip-flop on a number of issues. He wants America to both be more withdrawn and yet stronger, which is an internal contradiction, I think. But the bigger question is, what is the consequence of a potential withdrawal of United States leadership? I think it actually could have potentially beneficial effects in that we now get to see how much the US was doing to prop up the global order. And other countries are now having to step in and actually provide their fair share of global public goods. A lot of countries chose to free ride on US leadership in the past. And I think now you have these ironic situations where China is the champion of globalization, where Britain is the champion of NATO. There's a lot of interesting dynamics that are at play now. And I think this is an opportunity for a lot of third countries, or second countries, let's say, to step up and play a more leadership role and make it a more equitable and democratic global order.
Brenda, let's talk about the second country. Do you think Japan or China will be the second country to assume the leadership during the absence of Americans from the TPP notion?
I think the order in Asia is going to be very different over the next few decades. I think we're going to see the emergence of a multipolar order with many different countries trying to play a leadership role. I don't think we'll see a single country trying to play a leadership role. In time, China may assume that role, but I would see that being several decades down the track.
It's also worth emphasizing that Donald Trump is not synonymous with the United States government in reference to some of the earlier points. So although Donald Trump has positioned himself to withdraw the United States from a lot of its important relations, including relations in Asia, other centers of gravity in the US government have at least attempted to shore up what Donald Trump seems to be destroying. For example, Senator John McCain was recently in Australia. Chuck Schumer has recently spoken out against the withdrawal from the Paris Accords. So there are centers of gravity within the United States government who are pushing back against this. Obviously, Donald Trump is the most significant center of gravity, but there is movement against it within the United States.
What do you think of the global impact of a Belt and Road Initiative? Do you think China, with the AIIB and the RCEP, is more likely to replace the US? We're not talking about the disengagement of the US government, but let's look at the Belt and Road Initiative.
I think countries...
Free debate.
I think countries in the East Asian region generally are welcoming of access to funds for connectivity. But however, the onus is also on each East Asian country or ASEAN country to carefully assess their own national interests in tapping into this fund. And right now, AIB offers an alternative option to ADB, which has been funding infrastructure projects in the region. And the pie of infrastructure construction in Asia is big enough to accommodate 2 or more funding agencies, because there's such an acute need for infrastructure construction. So I think the onus is on each Asian countries to sort of assess what their national interest is, and also to ensure that the project value adds to their own economic development and does not detract from poverty alleviation in their own countries.
Sure. Your characterization of the One Belt, One Road initiative is one perspective of it. Obviously, there are other perspectives of it. There are concerns around it. And I think that takes us back to the issue of leadership, whether it's regional leadership or playing a more of a leadership role in the global economy as well. And you could then, by extension, be thinking about actually, if we're into a new stage of globalization, and for better or worse, that's been led by the West in the post-war period. If we're moving into a new stage of globalization, which we could term globalization with Chinese characteristics, then what would that look like? And I think we'll see some evidence of what that means in terms of carrots and sticks. Carrots in terms of soft funding for infrastructure projects, which of course there's massive need for within the region and beyond, and sticks in terms of other activities. Let's talk about Lotte in South Korea, for example. So I think we'll see a much more of a transactional role within the region, with China trying to assume a bit more of a regional leadership role, if not beyond that as well.
Well, I think to pick up on the point of transactional relationships, I think there is a trust problem that China has in the region. I think a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, but also in South Asia, have trouble trusting Chinese intentions when they come in with such large pots of money. You've also seen China moving more towards a model where Chinese companies not only construct, but also manage large infrastructure projects, raising questions about local sovereignty, local autonomy. Some countries, such as India, actually boycotted the OBOR meeting in China recently over concerns of sovereignty in South Asia. So China has to address that image problem before it can truly actually lay claim to replacing anyone in the region.
Part of the tradition for Shangri-La Security Dialogue, geopolitical issues will be the bulk of our discussions. Do you think, does it mean that the debate here would lay groundwork for the relationship between the dragon and elephant, India and China? Ben?
Yeah, well, I think it's extremely difficult to separate the economic and political aspects of these questions. So
China denies vehemently that the Belt and Road Initiative is intended to rival or antagonize the United States. So we want to be inclusive to make peace.
It doesn't really matter what China feels. It's a perception of other people, isn't it? So, for example, if we're looking at Japanese
Are you saying we are hostage of how other people perceive China?
Well, that's certainly going to be part of the issue we heard about trust.
Is that propaganda from the West-centric propaganda?
I would say the West has its own trust issues. I think any great power that seeks to invest in other countries is going to act as a lightning rod for nationalism in that country, and concerns of sovereignty and autonomy are going to come about.
Are you guys suggesting that whatever we say, whatever we do will be demonized anyway because we are not trusted because of ideological disputes?
I think because of the size and scale of China, you'll be
Size and scale, is that a discourse about China threat?
Not necessarily China threat, but it will be a mix of opportunity and also a mix of, encroaching on national interest. So it's going to be a complex situation. It's going to be a new normal that you have rising China and India, as well as other existing powers in the region. And so it really depends on each country's assessment of its own national interest.
I'm afraid one of the major issues facing ASEAN and China, the two major economic partners in this region, is on the one hand, ASEAN seeks security umbrella with the United States. On the other hand, they depend on China for investment and trade. However, Singapore might be a very interesting exception. It also aligns itself with Taiwan, which is viewed by the mainland of China as a renegade province. Do you guys believe that the growing economic interdependence in this region, and indeed like very much the rest of the world, will make yet another major geopolitical conflict inevitable or the other way around? Ben?
Yeah, well, I think that certainly economics creates important ties, but as we've returned to several times already, there is this trust deficit. And it's also worth emphasizing the historical relationship, the historical political relationship that China has with some of its neighbors in the Northeast as well, and their interests in, or better, their trust deficit with China. I'm speaking, of course, of South Korea and Japan. These countries may try to position themselves as an alternative center of gravity, along with, for example, India, which we've already spoken of, which also has its trust problems with China.
Rohan, yes,
I don't think that the interconnectedness that we see in the region at the moment will prevent a conflict occurring. I think if we look back to the period in Europe before the First World War, there was a lot of interconnectedness there that didn't prevent war. But I don't think it'll be the type of war that many commentators are predicting, a big US-China clash. I think the most dangerous flashpoint in the region at the moment is on the Korean Peninsula, and in fact it's the cooperation between the US and China that I think offers us our best hope of getting out of that particular flashpoint without conflict in the months and years ahead.
I would argue that there is a certain imbalance, though, in the interdependence that we see in the region. So I think that if you look at the trade deficits that a lot of these countries run with China, and the fact that China has a sort of a let's say, artificially floating currency, it has low manufacturing costs, it makes it very hard for China's trading partners to replace it as a trading partner, right? And that gives China a certain amount of leverage over other countries in the region, should it choose to use it. Now, that may not directly lead to conflict, but it can create, I think, crisis situations, or perhaps add to China's leverage in a potential crisis. So that is something that we should be concerned about.
Noteworthy was the Prime Minister Modi refused to attend the Belt and Road Initiative Summit Dialogue in Beijing that was recently concluded. Is that because of your strong suspicions about the Kashmir, the line of control in South Asia? Will that prevent India from exercising sound judgment? At the same time, we noticed that you have adopted an initiative from the US government that's called the New Silk Road, connecting South Asia with Southeast Asia. What do you think of this competitive nature?
So the New Silk Road is actually far more aimed at Central Asia and what India calls West Asia, so the Middle East, Iran, Turkmenistan, and those kinds of countries. There's no inherent, I think, challenge to OBOR or the other way around. I think what India's missing, so India's boycott was essentially a protest because the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, runs through contested territory between India and Pakistan, right? But what India's missing, I think, is OBOR as an opportunity. I think there's a lot that India can do to piggyback on the large amounts of investment that are coming in from the AIIB, from China, from the Sovereign Wealth Fund that China has set up as well for the Silk Road. India is right on the cusp of the 21st century maritime Silk Road as well. So I think there's a lot that India can do to benefit from that, and they're being short-sighted by not engaging with China on this issue.
Andy, what do you think of the importance of India? It's the most populous democracy, a catch-up economy, and certainly is pretty charming for both the United States and Japan to take it as its ally or very close strategic partner in its competition or in their competition against the growing influence of China geopolitically or geoeconomically in the Asia-Pacific region?
Of course, India is a very important economy. Its population will exceed China's at some point in the future. Its economic growth is higher than China's at the moment, and we forecast that to continue as well. Going back to the earlier point about sort of multipolar or centers of gravity within the region, I think it's actually quite useful to have India as a bulwark on the other side of Asia, if we're looking from sort of Japan west. So we'll continue to see countries like Japan, the United States, Britain, of course, Europe, and so on, trying to affect better relations, economic and political relations with India, as a matter of course.
Thank you so much. You are watching our special edition of Dialogue here in Singapore, on the sidelines of the Shangri-La Security Dialogue. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please.
Concerns are growing over ASEAN unity as it marks its 50th anniversary, as ASEAN's ambition to move beyond an initial mandate of confidence building towards preventative diplomacy and conflict resolution gain any momentum. China's low-profile diplomacy has been replaced by a more visible role on the world stage, as the Belt and Road Initiative recognizes Asia's economic geography. Will China stand as guardian of globalization in the region? While the Trump administration does not yet have clear policy lines on Asia, will the Shangri-La Dialogue provide a platform for Washington to reaffirm America's strategic commitment to its Asian allies?
Our various trade representatives and negotiators did their best to make sure that they could bring back something which the political leaderships could stand by and support.
As the security structure evolves, geographical tensions, including the South China Sea, will remain major tests for the future. What are the solutions for the security challenges of a multipolar Asia-Pacific? CGTN anchor Yang Rui is joined by 5 distinguished panelists in today's discussion. They are Lin Tai-wei from the East Asian Institute, National University of Singapore, and co-author of The Rise of China in India, a New Asian Drama. Andrew Staples, Director of the Economist Corporate Network in Southeast Asia. Rohan Mukherjee, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Yale and U.S. College, with a joint appointment by courtesy of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Brendan Taylor, Director of the Cora Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs at the College of Asia and the Pacific, Australian National University. And Benjamin A. Schukman, from the Division of Social Sciences at Yale and U.S.
Welcome back, gentlemen. One of the major issues that has embarrassed ASEAN, and indeed those overseas observers about the regional integration with the help of ASEAN, is ASEAN seems to present a lackluster performance within the regional economic blocs. Its trade with the outside partners through bilateral FTA, domestic initiative, would be much better, far outperforms its own intra-ASEAN trade. What do you think are the problems or the reasons behind this poor performance?
ASEAN is based on consensus-seeking, decision-making process. So to outsiders, it may be perceived as, some of the points that you have mentioned, that it could be stronger in intra-regional trading. And so in December 2015, quietly, ASEAN has formed the ASEAN Economic Community. It hopes that the ASEAN Economic Community can strengthen production networks intra-ASEAN so that the whole region can be more integrated and become more competitive, especially in the face of emerging, fast emerging large economies like India and China. So it's trying to push forward this project, and this is where AIB and One Belt, One Road plays a role in infrastructure construction. So this helps the ports and the highways and the railways, helps to integrate the economies of ASEAN closer together so that the countries within ASEAN can base its comparative advantage and produce certain parts of a particular product for exports within and outside ASEAN.
But I'm afraid the skeptical people and those pessimistic guys would argue the other way around. And all politics are local. Politicians are held hostage by their own constituents. Therefore, ASEAN is no exception. They have a lot more troubles to care internally.
That's absolutely the case. And if we look at the regionalization of production networks since the Asian financial crisis of 97, 98, for example, the acceleration of AFTA and so on, this is 20 years ago, and we're still looking to build those. But more importantly than sort of barriers to traded goods, it's non-tariff barriers, it's recognition of common standards and so on. And the pace there is painfully slow, and that is holding back economic growth, and that is hostage to domestic political considerations in all member states, possibly Singapore accepted there. But places like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, for example, will all argue for their own national champions over and above economic integration. At the same time, we have seen continued deepening of links within the region, interregional trade, interregional foreign direct investment continue to grow, which means that the ASEAN economy continues to strengthen. And a further point there, thinking about the sort of pace of integration, it's very interesting to look at Europe at the moment and whether we've had sort of policy overreach there in terms of accelerated integration and what lessons that holds for ASEAN. And is it possible that the slow consensus building process that we see within the region actually is more durable than the top-down regionalist project that we've seen in Europe, exemplified by the question of Britain voting to come out.
European Union is, of course, a very good example until Brexit, but NAFTA seems to have delivered a very good performance. Its extra trade with the global partners did not impress Donald Trump on the campaign trail. However, after the implementation of NAFTA, performance was excellent. What do you think of, say, such a comparison between ASEAN and NAFTA? Rohan, Ben, or Brandon?
Well, I think NAFTA, the problem there was not necessarily with NAFTA itself, but with the domestic politics of the United States. I think the failure of the Democrats of the last two administrations to effectively politically sell globalization to American middle classes led to Donald Trump's victory in a sense. NAFTA did produce a lot of goods for American people, but yes, some jobs were lost, but there was not enough readjustment within the American economy for that to happen. I think the comparison ASEAN is actually interesting in that ASEAN societies are far more geared to provide social safety nets to people who are losers from the process of globalization. However, at the same time, the fact that there isn't enough integration in ASEAN is not necessarily a bad thing at this moment. I mean, there is economic logic to that, which is comparative advantage, as was mentioned, in that at the moment there's a lot of similarity between ASEAN economies, at least a number of them, Singapore being an exception, and therefore they have more incentive to trade with other countries that have a comparative advantage in different sectors of the economy, right? Once there is specialization and diversification among ASEAN economies, we should expect to see greater trade between them. So I don't think this is really a problem at this stage.
Brandon, what do you think of the underperformance of ASEAN despite the smart idea of a consensus building?
Well, I think ASEAN itself is a very diverse grouping. I think it's one of the challenges that we face. Trying to build a consensus amongst that grouping is going to be very challenging. There is discussion very serious discussion within ASEAN at the moment about an internal reform and perhaps looking at other ways, alternatives to the consensus-based approach to decision making. But I think unless and until that happens, I think we're likely to see ASEAN continue to make gradual, very glacial progress moving forward.
Another problem with ASEAN, I'm afraid, is the discrepancy politically. For example, Myanmar, despite the impressive progress of democratization with Aung San Suu Kyi assuming the de facto leadership, the military still accounts for much of the decision making, and therefore it's very difficult for Myanmar to be accepted widely by other member states of ASEAN. Do you think this hurdle will prevent ASEAN from further advancing its integration?
I think ASEAN, with the acceptance of the former socialist economies, the CLMV countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, is trying to integrate these new members into the organization so that the gap between them narrows. And in this case, Vietnam has done extremely well. Its economy has grown tremendously, and it's narrowing the gap between the CLMV countries and ASEAN 5 countries. So Myanmar, as the latest entrance, will have this curve that it has to go through. And again, this is where infrastructure building comes in handy, because that's probably the first thing that Myanmar needs in order to develop its own economy and catch up with the rest of the ASEAN countries. ASEAN is also doing its part to help Myanmar integrate not just economically, but also politically and culturally, with people-to-people exchanges, training programs that set up to train people from Myanmar. And so this all helps capacity building within Myanmar to narrow the gap that it has with other countries.
What about Vietnam, which was left quite disillusioned by President Trump's rejection of TPP? Instead, the Prime Minister of Vietnam visited Singapore recently to sign a lot of treatment. For example, they pin their hopes on bilateral trade with the United States instead of turning to TPP. At the same time, Japan wants to continue with the negotiations on building a arc of prosperity and freedom through TPP. What do you think of this government, which might still be viewed as a communist regime? Ben?
Well, I think in this maneuver, you can really see how there is indeed a sort of multipolar order evolving. I mean, the TPP involved only part of ASEAN, and I think Japan in particular has an interest in keeping it that way as a mechanism of its own foreign interests. So again, it comes back to the idea that politics and economics are not neatly separable.
So for Vietnam, the TPP was very clearly regarded as a policy anchor to enforce further reform and change domestically as well. So clearly, Vietnam is going to be disappointed that the States has pulled out of that, and you have to, even though Japan has done a volte-face and is now promoting the TPP 11, whereas 2 or 3 months ago, Prime Minister Abe was on record as saying, without the States, it doesn't make any sense at all. Will a TPP 11 without the States make sense for someone like Vietnam without access to the American market? And I think the same issue could be said for Malaysia as well. So I'm not very bullish on prospects for TPP or indeed any other free trade agreement that's being discussed at the moment. RCEP is already well behind schedule, for example.
Very quickly, I'd like to have your quick answer to the last question. Do you think it's a high time for us to brush aside the idea of a Cold War? We should do business for business sake, and fortunately we have this President Donald Trump, whose business executive style, transactional style, may be a blessing instead of a curse for the regional co-prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region. Very quickly, Tai-Wei.
A bipolar Cold War is definitely a thing of the past. Right now there's much greater interdependence between countries, and that should be the focus.
Andy?
I would say that President Trump stepping back from the global leadership role that the States is playing will discombobulate the global economy. We are in a state of flux. I'm not sure where that leads us.
Rohan?
I think being a business person, you need to know who your shareholders are. I don't think Donald Trump in the global scenario knows who his shareholders are. If he has some guidance on that, he perhaps can do great things for East Asia.
Brendan?
In a perfect world, yes, but I think we're entering a new era of great power politics, and I think if a Cold War is the worst that we get out of that, that would be a good outcome. I think what we don't want is a Cold War turning into a hot war.
You know, one of the defining characteristics of the Cold War was that there were two great powers, and it seems more likely that whatever's coming next will not be two great powers. It will be more than two great powers. Germany or the EU, perhaps the United States still, China, perhaps India, etc. So it's a far more complicated and chaotic situation.
Well, politicians around the world have been wrestling with the idea of whether we're going to have more globalization or deglobalization as what President Donald Trump stands for. Anyway, it's time for China and the rest of the world to work in partnership for a collective bright future of co-prosperity. That is the essence of the Belt and Road Initiative put forward by President Xi Jinping 4 years ago in Kazakhstan. With that, we come to the end of the special edition of Dialogue in Singapore. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.